How does one of the most influential technical death metal bands suddenly lose almost every member, only for many of those musicians to eventually end up in another band that fans now call the spiritual successor? This is the story of the Faceless and the Zenith Passage. Long before the Faceless became one of technical death metal's most defining bands, they were just another local act in Southern California. The Faceless was founded in 2004 by Michael Keane and Brandon Griffin in Encino, California. Their debut album, Akeldama, did not even start life as a full-length record. The band originally entered the studio intending to record a 4-song EP, but after lineup changes during the recording process, the project grew to a complete album. By the time Akeldama was nearing completion, the Faceless had already built a strong reputation in Southern California and attracted interest from several record labels. The band ultimately chose to sign with a brand new record label founded by Ash Avildsen, whom they already had a personal relationship with from playing shows with his former band, Reflux, a band that notably had included Toast Navasi on guitar, as well as Ash's proven record as a booking agent. At the time, Sumerian Records was an unknown startup, and signing with it was a leap of faith, especially since they already had much safer options from already established labels. In hindsight, it would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions in both the band's history and the label's early growth. Now we arrive at Akeldama, Sumerian No. 1, the record that first put the Faceless on the map. Even today, Akeldama stands apart from many of its contemporaries. It's as much a jazz record as it is a death metal record, blending blistering technical riffs with jazz fusion-inspired harmony, atmospheric keyboards, and progressive song structures. That unique sound didn't happen from an accident. Michael Keane grew up in a household full of musicians with a father who played fusion guitar, and his biggest musical hero wasn't even a metal guitarist at all. It was jazz fusion legend Allan Holdsworth. Those influences became part of the Faceless' identity from the very beginning. The album itself wasn't written in a matter of months either. According to Keane, portions of the material dated back to his high school years, with some songs having been developed over nearly 3 years before the album's release. Lyrically, Akeldama also distinguished itself from most of the extreme metal scene at the time. Rather than focusing on gore or shock value, its lyrics drew inspiration from mythology, philosophy, and occult imagery, creating an atmosphere that felt ancient and mysterious. The writing was a collaborative effort between vocalist Derek Rydquist, Michael Keane, and drummer Burt Batdorf, giving the album a poetic quality that matched its ambitious musical direction. This record quickly established the Faceless as one of the most exciting new bands in extreme metal. The Faceless had gone from a relatively unknown local act to sharing stages with many of the bands that had inspired them, including Necrophagist, the Black Dahlia Murder, As Blood Runs Black, Decapitated, and Nile, exposing the band to a much wider audience and proving they belonged in some of the biggest tours in the genre. But as impressive as Akeldama was, it was only the beginning. Released in 2008, Planetary Duality would become the album that elevated the Faceless from a promising technical death metal band into one of the defining acts of the era. Michael Keane later described it as the record I've always wanted to hear, but never have. That philosophy is evident throughout the entire album. Songs seamlessly transition between brutal technical passages, soaring melodies, atmospheric interludes, and moments of restraint before exploding back into overwhelming intensity. The writing process was different for this album as well. Rather than being written over the course of years, including parts written back in high school, Planetary Duality was written in one focused time period with one concept in mind, which is why it feels like such a cohesive experience. The album was just as ambitious as its music. The lyrics explored conspiracy theories, hidden governments, religion, interdimensional beings, and humanity's place in the universe, forming a cohesive sci-fi narrative that became one of the album's defining characteristics. One of my favorite details on the entire album comes in on track 8, Planetary Duality 1, Hideous Revelation. The song samples the infamous 1997 coast-to-coast AM phone call from a frantic man claiming to be a former Area 51 employee, warning that the government knows about extra-dimensional beings and that humanity is facing an impending disaster, which led to the feed signal being interrupted. Believe it or not, it's a very fitting way to reinforce the album's themes of conspiracy, hidden knowledge, and alien intervention. And you can't tell me that that isn't one of the most fitting samples to put into a technical death metal record. The success of Planetary Duality pushed the Faceless onto even larger stages, earning touring opportunities with major acts such as Meshuggah, Lambs of God, and In Flames, and cemented the band's reputation within the genre. Around the same period, Michael Keene's reputation began extending beyond the Faceless as well. As both a musician and a producer, he worked on influential releases, including Born of Osiris's The New Rain EP, and Veil Amaya's The Common Man's Collapse and Id. Through both his work with the Faceless and his production for other bands, Keene became one of the key figures in shaping the polished technical sound that would later be referred to as Sumerian core. After the success of Planetary Duality, it looked like the Faceless had nowhere to go but up. Instead, the years that followed would mark the beginning of one of the most turbulent histories in all of modern metal. In 2010, Brandon Griffin left the band. Even though Michael was the primary songwriter, this is important because Brandon was a co-founder who was there since day one, not simply just another bassist. The Faceless supported his decision to step away, and he went on to become a session bassist for Cynic. This was followed by Derek leaving the band. There was no immediate statement for when this happened, as he actually left briefly in the past with dreams to pursue college. But fans noticed when in the European tour, a different vocalist was performing. This is important because the voice that everyone has associated with the Faceless is now gone. Later, Derek simply stated that he was no longer emotionally or artistically fulfilled by being a vocalist for the group. And being a professional musician was kind of ruining my love for music, he can be quoted saying. Later, Michael Keene went on to work on the third studio album, Autotheism, which doesn't get as much credit as it deserves. He wasn't trying to make a successor to Planetary Duality, he was going in a whole different direction with things like clean singing and more influence from classical music, which was a very polarizing change from the brutal tech death that preceded it. And of course, it was simply made by different musicians such as Keene himself handling clean vocals, Jeff Fico on lead vocals, and Wes Hotch additionally taking the role as guitarist. Evan Brewer bringing a slap and pop bass style, and Lyle Cooper completing the lineup on drums. Autotheism was released and actually charted higher than both of the previous albums, making it the highest charting release in the band's history, with contemporary reviews praising the album's ambition, while many fans were surprised by its stylistic departure from Planetary Duality. Then everything went seemingly quiet for a few years, and this time again it only took a few years after the album's release for everyone to leave the Faceless yet again, leaving Michael Keene the only member who was there for Autotheism, just as it was before after Planetary Duality's album cycle. For nearly 3 years, there was complete silence. By the time the Faceless finally returned, the band would once again look almost nothing like the ones fans had remembered. And among the new faces was a guitarist whose own band would eventually become inseparable from the Faceless's legacy. While the Faceless had seemingly gone silent, another story was quietly beginning. In 2012, a guitarist named Justin McKinney started a small home recording project known as the Zenith Passage. Rather than assembling a full band from the start, McKinney handled virtually every aspect of the songwriting himself, using the project as an outlet to have total creative freedom to write uncompromising, highly complex technical death metal. His writing inspirations drew heavily from the complex rhythmic ideas of Meshuggah, as well as the melodic and harmonic language of jazz fusion, again noting the legendary Allen Holdsworth. The same musical territory that happened to overlap with many of the same influences that helped shape Michael Keene's writing years earlier. He also included the Faceless themselves as an additional inspiration. When Cosmic Dissonance released in 2013, the Zenith Passage wasn't even a fully realized touring band. It was simply Justin McKinney's vision brought to life. Despite its underground status, the EP quickly gained attention throughout the tech death community. Listeners immediately noticed the similarities to the Faceless's blend of technicality, atmosphere, and progressive songwriting, leading many to describe the project as Faceless worship. It put Justin McKinney's name on the radar of tech death fans everywhere. At the time, few people could have predicted that the small bedroom project would eventually become intertwined with the very band it was so often compared to. But within just a few years, Justin McKinney would receive an opportunity that would forever connect the histories of the Zenith Passage and the Faceless. In early 2015, the Faceless announced that Justin McKinney would be joining the band as their newest guitarist. For many fans, it seemed like the perfect fit. One of technical death metal's fastest rising guitarists had just joined one of the genre's most influential bands, and expectations for the future were higher than ever. While Justin was touring with the Faceless, he was also quietly finishing another project that had been years in the making. What had begun as a one-man recording project was finally evolving into a full-fledged band. That project was the Zenith Passage's debut full-length album, Solipsist. If Cosmic Dissonance introduced Justin McKinney to the technical death metal underground, Solipsist made him into one of the genre's most promising songwriters. The album retained the very technicality and atmospheric songwriting that drew comparisons to the Faceless from the very beginning, but expanded on those ideas with even denser rhythmic writing, ambitious song structures, and a stronger emphasis on melody and atmosphere. Rather than feeling like a collection of technical exercises, Solipsist played like a carefully crafted journey from the beginning to end. Lyrically, the album explored philosophical ideas surrounding consciousness, perception, and the nature of reality. All themes reflected in the title itself. Solipsism, the philosophical concept that only one's mind can be known to exist with certainty and is the only thing that can be proven to be real in the universe. Combined with its cosmic atmosphere and progressive songwriting, the album established an identity that was unmistakably the Zenith Passage's own, even as listeners continued drawing comparisons to the Faceless. These comparisons only grew louder upon release. Contemporary reviewers frequently likened Solipsist to Planetary Duality, with some praising it as a worthy spiritual successor. Whether viewed as a ripoff or simply the work of musicians sharing similar influences, one thing was undeniable: Justin McKinney had become one of the most respected composers in modern technical death metal. Michael Keane was actually heavily involved in this album's production. Justin has since described Michael as both a mentor and a major influence during this period. He taught him advanced recording techniques, and even went as far as to let him borrow some of his gear. Although Michael was originally expected to produce the entire album, production delays ultimately led the band to complete the record with producer Zach Allren. While Michael's final contributions were more limited than originally planned, where he did mostly engineering work and he also tracked Greg Hampton's vocals, Justin McKinney found himself in an extraordinary position. He had successfully transformed a bedroom recording project into one of the most acclaimed new bands in technical death metal, while simultaneously serving as the newest guitarist for the Faceless. Unfortunately, that partnership was just the beginning, and the most turbulent chapter in the Faceless's history was still to come. With Justin McKinney now in the band and Solipsist earning widespread praise, it felt like the Faceless had assembled another dream lineup. Expectations were incredibly high. Many fans hoped the band's next record would capture the same technical intensity that had made Planetary Duality such a landmark release while still combining it with Justin's fresh songwriting. Instead, fans were left waiting. Months passed with little news. In September 2015, the Faceless released single The Spiraling Void, which reintroduced the longtime vocalist Derek Rydquist for a guest appearance and giving fans their first taste of new material. But after that, the silence returned. Even after Justin McKinney stated in 2016 that the album was essentially finished, its release continued to slip further into the future. By the time Becoming a Ghost finally arrived in December of 2017, it had become the band's full-length album in 5 years. When listeners finally heard the record, the reaction was anything but unanimous. Rather than returning to the style of Planetary Duality, Michael Keane continued exploring the progressive direction he had begun on Autotheism even further. Clean vocals became more prominent than ever before. The songwriting lead further into atmospheric and dreamlike textures, and moments of brutal technical death metal were castrated by melodic passages, orchestration, and shoegaze-like influences. It was an album that prioritized mood and emotion just as much as technicality. The lineup itself was still remarkable. Justin McKinney contributed lead guitar work, Ken Sorceron made his only appearance as the band's unclean vocalist, Wes Moreland handled the drums, and Derek Rydquist returned for guest vocals. On paper, it looked like one of the strongest lineups the Faceless had ever assembled, and critics generally praised the album's ambition and musicianship. Some even called it the band's strongest progressive efforts. Fans, however, were far more divided. Some appreciated its willingness to evolve beyond the expectations set by Planetary Duality, while others had spent 5 years hoping for a return to the sound that they first fell in love with. Unfortunately, before those debates about the music had time to settle, they would be overshadowed by something far bigger, and towards the increasingly turbulent state of the Faceless itself. How did yet another incredibly talented lineup in the hands of the Faceless dissolve almost immediately after releasing an album? By early 2018, and Becoming a Ghost was finally released after years of delays. Fans were still debating about the music itself before the conversation abruptly shifted away from the album entirely. On March 19th, 2018, 3 members announced their departures from the Faceless on the very same day. Justin McKinney, vocalist Ken Sorceron, and drummer Bryce Butler all publicly confirmed they were leaving the band. Reading those statements today is striking. Rather Rather than attacking one and another, all three musicians expressed gratitude towards their bandmates and reflected on the positive experiences they had shared. At the same time, each statement hinted that there were much deeper problems behind the scenes than the fans had realized. Justin explained that he felt it was time to remove himself from the band. Ken wrote that the stress and anxiety surrounding the situation had eventually outweighed the good times. Bryce echoed similar feelings, describing a reality that no longer matched what he had hoped the band would be. And for longtime fans, the situation felt strangely familiar. This isn't the first time the Faceless had lost nearly an entire lineup. It wasn't even the second. After Planetary Duality, the band had been rebuilt. After Autotheism, it's been rebuilt again. Now only months after releasing Becoming a Ghost, history was repeating itself for a third time. Amid the departures, Michael Keane publicly stated that the Faceless would continue. Rather than announcing the end of the band, he explained that he was already searching for new musicians and intended to rebuild once again. Only days later, however, the story took another turn. Former members began speaking more openly about their experiences. Justin McKinney published a lengthy statement describing what had happened over his time in the band, making serious allegations regarding addiction, finances, missed obligations, and the overall working environment. Around the same time period, Michael Keane had already publicly acknowledged his own struggle with drug addiction and described himself as being in recovery. Almost overnight, discussions about the music from him becoming a ghost disappeared and was replaced by conversations about canceled performances, lineup instability, and uncertainty surrounding the band's future. For the first time since their formation, many fans openly questioned whether the Faceless would ever recover. Looking back across the rest of the band's history, a pattern had become impossible to ignore. Every defining era of the Faceless had been built around an extraordinary group of musicians, and every time the band reached their creative peak, those musicians would eventually move on. Yet despite everything that happened, Michael Keane once again found himself exactly where he'd been sitting before, standing alone. While the Faceless prepared to rebuild for a third time, something else was happening at the same exact moment. The musicians who helped define so many different eras of the Faceless weren't disappearing, they were just beginning to gather somewhere else. For years, the Faceless had become a band trapped in an endless cycle. A groundbreaking album would be released, an incredible lineup would form, and eventually those musicians would leave. By 2018, it seemed as though history had repeated itself once again, but the story didn't end there. While the Faceless continued searching for its next chapter, the Zenith Passage was quietly building its own. What had started years earlier as Justin McKinney's bedroom recording project had gradually evolved into something much larger. One by one, familiar faces began appearing alongside him. Derek Rodquist, the unmistakable voice behind Akeldama and Planetary Duality, had already become a permanent member of the band. Brandon Griffin, who had co-founded the Faceless back in 2004, eventually made his return to Tech Death by joining the Zenith Passage. This lineup is just simply impossible to ignore. In 2023, the Zenith Passage released Datalysium. Nearly 7 years after Solipsis, the band returned with an album that was met with widespread acclaim from critics and fans alike. Rather than abandoning the sound they had spent years refining, Datalysium expanded upon it. The record balanced technicality with memorable melodies, dense rhythmic writing, atmospheric passages, and a level of compositional maturity that reflected more than a decade of Justin McKinney's growth as a songwriter. Like Planetary Duality before it, Datalysium felt less like a collection of individual songs and more like a complete experience. The performances were extraordinary across the board. Justin's guitar work had continued to evolve into something unmistakably his own. Derek Rodquist delivered some of the strongest vocal performances of his career, and the band as a whole just sounded tighter and more confident than ever before. By this point, comparisons to the Faceless had begun to change. In the early years of Cosmic Dissonance, many listeners dismissed the Zenith Passage as Faceless worship. Years later, those same comparisons had taken on an entirely different meaning. Rather than asking whether the Zenith Passage sounded too much like the Faceless, many fans were asking a different question altogether. Had the Zenith Passage become the creative home for many of the musicians who had defined the Faceless's most beloved era? It's a difficult question to answer. Michael Keane's influence on modern technical death metal is undeniable. Without his songwriting, production work, and willingness to push beyond the boundaries of the genre, neither the Faceless nor countless bands that followed would sound the way they do today. At the same time, the musicians who helped bring those records to life continued creating music long after leaving the Faceless, and many of them ultimately simply just found themselves reunited under a different name. Maybe that's why the legacy of the Faceless has become so fascinating. It's not confined to one lineup, it's not confined to one album, and it isn't even confined to a single band. Whether you believe the Zenith Passage is a spiritual successor to the Faceless, or simply another exceptional tech death band forged by many of the same musicians, is ultimately up to you. But one thing is certain, more than 20 years after two musicians started a local band in Encino, California, the music they helped create continues to shape tech death through both the Faceless and the Zenith Passage. Sometimes a band's greatest legacy isn't the name on the album cover, sometimes it's the people who continue carrying that legacy forward. As of today, the story's still being written. The Zenith Passage has already begun looking toward its next chapter, releasing their newest single, Fleshbound Reliquary, while confirming that work on another full-length album is already underway. At the same time, after years of uncertainty, Michael Keane has confirmed that he is once again writing and recording new music with the Faceless after taking what he described as some much-needed time away. More recently, he has also shared that new material is actively being demoed, giving fans reason to believe the next band's chapter may finally be taking shape. Whether either band's next release will pass up Datalesium or Planetary Duality is impossible to know, but after everything these musicians has been through, maybe that's not the most important question anymore. The real takeaway is that despite lineup changes, setbacks, personal struggles, and years of uncertainty, the creativity that made these bands so influential never truly disappeared. It simply found new ways to move forward. And as a fan of tech death, I don't think we could ask for much more than that. One thing though, for a band called Faceless, Michael Keane has always seemed to have a perfectly visible face. If anything, after watching countless live videos and guitar playthroughs, I think the band has been misnamed this entire time. It should have been called the Pinkyless. Thanks for watching.